Trish, this should be somewhere. Anyway. I first met Robert in 2004, a kind of very normative management conference in Scotland, and I was hovering over the bookstalls, picking up a stray volume that alluded to the word philosophy. And this man kind of loomed up behind me and looked over my shoulder and said, "You're not from round here, are you?" No? And since then, over the ensuing 11 years, we've had a wonderful relationship with one another, both as friends and as writing academic colleagues. I won't go on a long list of Robert's accomplishments in terms of his outputs, because that would actually be to denigrate what he stands for. He's not really interested in what's produced. He's much more interested in the process of producing. There are, I think if you want to summarize him in terms of my experience of Robert, there are two really important qualities that he brings to our community. The first is that he's incredibly childish. Now this may sound slightly, but if you're aware of the parable in Nietzsche's Zarathustra, being a child is probably the most difficult thing to achieve. As Eliot says, the last to be discovered is always the beginning. And being childish is this capacity to bring innocence into play with experience, to not use what we know as a crutch, but to throw it away and let innocence read to experience, as the poet William Blake was wont to do. So childishness is something that's really kind of undervalued, but I think is incredibly important, and something that Robert really kind of exhibits in quite a provocative way. And I think the other quality I find most impressive with Robert is he's very vague. Yeah? He refuses to commit to anything, yeah? including it seems an institution. He's been at more institutions than I can possibly name in terms of employers. They must be fed up of him moving all the time. But the vague, again, being very serious about this for a minute. It's very important that you don't be too explicit, because in being too explicit, you're not leaving gaps. And being vague is to allow people in, is to leave things incomplete. And in leaving things incomplete, you rouse the faculties of others. You encourage them in. And I don't know anyone in our field who's more skilled in the general art of the conversation, in allowing you to give voice to your ideas and him helping you along, nudging you along. And so it's with absolute pleasure I introduce my friend and colleague, Robert Chia.
Robin, thanks very much for your very kind and interesting compliments. My wife is sitting there. I think she will recognize some elements of what you're saying. Thanks very much, and good afternoon to you all, and thank you for being here. Thanks also to EGOS and Harry especially, who persuaded me to come and do this so-called keynote speech. It feels more like a supplementary note at the moment. This here in Athens, at this point in time, when they are experiencing this great moment of deep uncertainty about their future. So I'm really humbled and honored. And somehow, given this extraordinary set of circumstances that the Greek nation is facing, what I have to say seems rather trivial, and in comparison. Robin is right about me being vague and necessarily so as a kind of survival instinct, really. When Harry asked me to do this keynote sometime in September, I think it was last year, my initial instinct was to run away, to decline. Partly because I don't really think I have terribly much to say. And also, increasingly, I feel that I feel a sense of despair about the inadequacy of talk and words and analysis upon analysis, as it were, endlessly. Somehow, they don't seem to be resolving the kind of real-world problems that we are confronted with. And I'm getting a bit disillusioned, shall I say, okay? So that's part of the reason why I half hesitated. Nevertheless, I realize increasingly how much indebted I am to this EGOS community of scholars whose intellectual work have challenged and transformed my own thinking very, very significantly and expanded my own horizon of comprehension over the last, well, nearly 30 years now. Many of you who have written, unbeknown to you, have had significant impact on my thinking. And to this I say to you, thank you. Your work has helped transform my thinking, but there's one person in particular who is sadly not here to acknowledge my appreciation. He is Bob Cooper, my close friend, mentor, and PhD supervisor. To him, I owe much. And for that reason, it feels as if it's right for me to now give something back to this community, something small, a bit of a gesture to say thank you very much. So this is why I am here. This conference theme on the examined life actually gives me a bit of an excuse to be a bit self-indulgent. So since it is about examining life, I'm going to scrutinize my own past life as well. So please, I hope you will bear with me if I seem at times a little nostalgic and even idiosyncratic in my reflections. But I think there is some method in this madness, as they say. The title of my talk, Examining and Theorizing Organization and Organized Lives Back to the Rough Ground, is actually prompted by, I'm sure it's a partial reading of Wittgenstein's observation that we seem to have become all too enamored with the frictionless ease with which we seem to use language and logic. Robin being a prime example. We have inadvertently come down this slippery slope of what I call abstract theorizing, and that it may be time for us to get back to the rough ground of everyday lived experience, to more firmly ground our theoretical efforts. In other words, I'm appealing for a kind of what William James called radical empiricism. Okay? I'm of course reminded that Kurt Lewin once said that there is nothing so practical as a good theory. Well, that may well be the case, but we might still insist with Wittgenstein that any genuinely good theory must be firmly grounded in what he calls the whole hurly-burly of human actions, that lived reality. So, this is a task for us, a challenge for us. To do this well, we must strive to develop a kind of what I would call childlike, innocent, pristine seeing and sensing that is more able to do justice to the very complex nuances of our empirical reality. So in this regard, I'm capitalizing on my childlikeness What do I mean by this? It's actually about developing what I call fidelity in our observations. All observations, all seeing are not of equal quality. In other words, I think there's a need to refine our ability to observe and to see more pristinely. That's really crucial for us to develop any kind of good theory. Why is this the case? I guess it's because, borrowing a phrase from William James, the deliverance of our senses far outstrip our linguistic and logical, far outstrip our linguistic and conceptual abilities. And since this is particularly the case, since our experiences are more fine-grained and more sensuously detailed, then our theories are able to currently adequately capture. So it's not straightforward. We have to constantly struggle to remain ever faithful to those experiences that we have. So this is basically the central thrust of my presentation today, that we need to develop an art of observing, a kind of sensitivity to the transience and temporality of what is going on in the world. Okay. There was a track that I was sitting in which was focusing on time and temporality. I think this is a dimension that is inadequately actually acknowledged in our theorizing. So what I'm saying is intended to draw further attention to our need to be attuned to the mobility of our lives. The term that sometimes I have used in the past, the notion of becoming, that life is always unfolding and becoming. Now, controversially, I want to start with a slide from what I call the Socratic Imperative. Most of you will know by now, if not long before. I have to confess, only after I agreed to do this, I started reading these significant portions of Plato's Apology. And this phrase kept on coming back to me. This idea that, and again, if I say that to talk every day about virtue and examining myself and others is the greatest good to man, and that the unexamined life is not worth living, you will believe me still less. This is what Socrates is purported to have said. I have to confess that this last part, the unexamined life is not worth living, rankles a little with me. It seems a little harsh. Are there not circumstances and situations when we should just be present and experience what life throws at us? You know, absorb it, for better or worse, without needing to constantly resort to scrutinizing and dissecting it with our reason and intellect. Maybe that can happen sometime later, but I suspect that we may be too quick in moving towards this intellectual mode, so to speak. The other thing is, can all our experiences be subjected to such rigorous scrutiny or not? I have some doubts. Again, as I said, if the deliverance of our senses far outstrip linguistic and logical conceptual capabilities, then we are not always able to do justice to those experiences. So I actually was a little relieved when I came across the work of William James, who said that he found himself compelled to give up logic and reason in order to understand life. Because reality, life, expedience, concreteness, immediacy, call it what you will, exceeds our logic, overflows, and surrounds it. So it seems to me that sometimes one needs to simply just immerse oneself fully and unthinkingly into the stream of life and experience what life throws at us without resorting to reason and representation. And this thought brings me back a long way to my unexamined life in Singapore in the early 1950s. It was a kind of very basic, simple, subsistence kind of living, certainly unreflective and unexamined, but nevertheless, in my view at least, still very rich, very inventive, and very fulfilling. So when we found coconut trees around us, we found great joy in climbing them. When standpipes appeared to replace well water, we learned how to play underneath. And when it rained and the whole place flooded because of the monsoon rains, we caught green beetles and used these to propel our wooden boats that we made from discarded wooden crates. There was no such thing called toys. We did what the environment afforded us, And I think, without thinking very much about it, it was a life very fulfilling in many ways, and what the Chinese philosopher Zhuangzi calls a life of uncarved simplicity. Indeed, Zhuangzi reckons that this was the perfect world, this innocent, perfect world, where people do what is right, but do not know that it is righteous. Love one another, but do not know this is benevolence. So in a sense, people took care of each other based on a kind of natural sympathy and on a sense of what Adam Smith, in his theory of moral sentiment, calls a sense of fellow feeling, rather than on reason principles. For Zhuangzi, it is only when the sages come along, huffing and puffing after benevolence, reaching on tiptoe for righteousness, that the world becomes divided, conflict ensues. So in a sense, something is lost. This innocence is lost. And maybe this is what the poet T.S. Eliot was getting at when he asked, where is the life we have lost in living? Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information? Somehow, we, in our obsession with knowledge and information, we have lost something in the whole process. And this is probably because we have become too intellectual too quickly, it seems to me. Whitehead certainly thinks so. He says, we are too exclusively bookish in our scholastic routine. In the Garden of Eden, Adam saw animals before he named them. In the current educational system, I should say, children name the animals before they saw them. So in other words, we use categories. We learn about categories and then we see, I grew up and I was born on the sand floor of an attic house, and the person who delivered me was a woman who owned a stud pig. And she brought this stud pig around to basically inseminate the sows in the small farms around. And then when they were up for delivery, she basically went and delivered these little piglets. So I was one of her piglets. How about that? So I saw animals before I ever named them. All right? So we have become too preoccupied with our intellectual analysis, with concepts and abstract theories, and neglect to strengthen our habits of concrete appreciation. One of the major consequences of this, as Whitehead points out, is that we end up mistaking our representations for reality. He calls this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. So, perhaps this is what Magritte was trying to get at in his now famous painting of the pipe, which I remember seeing in the Museum of Modern Art in Brussels in 1990, I think it was, when I was still trying to do my PhD and wondering what this was all about, you know. But it gave me a sense of why representations was such a big problem. Okay. Funnily, my initiation into this problem of representation happened in my business career in the early 1980s. Then I was the factory manager of a high-speed two-piece can manufacturing plant, a company that is no longer existing, but it was a group called the Metal Box Group. And it was, there was a significant presence in the Asia Pacific. So I ran this factory, and basically it was making soft drink and beer cans to the tune of about 1.15 million cans a day. You know, 800 cans flying past you in a minute. So high speed, high tech. You know, we were very proud about this computerized thing. You know, 40 million investment in those days was a big thing. Anyway, one of our major problems was that of quality and reject rates. Compared to our sister plants in UK, in Eurocans in Belgium, and Superbox in Italy and so forth, 3.5% in those days was quite respectable. We were actually better than they were. So I thought, okay, we're all right. However, it just happened that one day I went and attended a talk given by the group managing director of Hitachi Televisions Japan, who was invited by the National Productivity Board of Singapore to give a talk about quality control and you know, improving quality and stuff like that. And it turns out that making 2 million television sets a month, their reject rate was 0.03%, almost 100 times better than ours, or more than 100 times better than ours. Of course, I was impressed. So after the talk, I approached him and I said, look, what do you do, you know, in your whole manufacturing process? How do you manage to achieve this kind of incredibly impressive quality levels? And but he didn't answer my question. Yeah. Instead, he asked me a question. He asked me, how many television sets do you have at home? And I thought, what's that got to do with my question anyway? He said, how many television sets have you got at home? I said, well, one. He says, you know, if your TV at home is a Hitachi, and if it doesn't work, for you, it is not 0.03%. It is 100% failure. This was for the first time my initiation into what you might call zero defects. Okay? But it was not just about zero defects, but it is about the fact that I had been seduced by statistics. I was relying on figures to justify how good or how not so good we were. And his was about the raw, real experience of every of his customers. That's the difference. So it made me realize that somehow I was already thinking in abstract terms rather than the lived experience of my customers. And I'd forgotten that sensitivity to people's lived experience is what makes the fundamental difference between, and ultimately, between success and failure. This is something that I would vouch for. For me, this was an important moment in my own in the transformation of my own outlook. Well, that set my thoughts going, and by 1985, I had become disillusioned enough to take a year off, and I actually went and did a master's at Lancaster University. And guess what? I came across the work of people like Gibson Burrell and Gareth Morgan, sociological paradigms, Wilmot and Matt Alverson's stuff on critical management, and of course the Aston Group and whatever. And I thought, I've never come across this stuff before. What are all these people talking about? So paradigms and worldviews became a kind of much touted thing. Paradigm wars they were talking about in those days, Anyway, so the one thing that really had a lasting impact on me was that I met Bob Cooper, and I became very close friends with him. And his post-structuralist critique of representation led me to dig deeper into this issue of perception and reality and conception and so forth. And that is how I got into the writings of Alfred North Whitehead. For me, he gives the best sort of definition of what a paradigm is: a general form of the forms of thought, which, like the air we breathe, is so translucent and so pervading and so seemingly necessary that only by extreme effort can we become aware of it. In other words, you can't just change paradigms like you change shirt. More fundamental, I also came to realize that for Whitehead, we are in a kind of dilemma. We can't do without these abstractions. Yet, we need to constantly revise them. We have to let go in order to renew what we think we know. And this theme of letting go, I will come back to at the end, hopefully, of my presentation. Well, the critique of representation became then something I pursued, reading Bergson, his introduction to metaphysics. I think it is a little book where he wrote, "Analysis multiplies without end the number of its points of view in order to complete its always incomplete representation, and ceaselessly varies its symbol that it may perfect the always imperfect translation." In other words, we're struggling and chasing after reality, but we never ever get there. William James, who made me realize that concepts are really instrumental. They are ministerial. We use concepts to harness reality, to drive it to our ends. But they falsify as well as omit. And of course, how could I not, by that time, how could I ignore the work of people like Derrida and Lyotard, and on the postmodern condition, on the critique of grand narratives, meta-narratives, and so forth, and the logocentrism and the logic of representation. And so that sort of opened my eyes to this question. Funnily, I went back and started reading. The funny thing is that you have to be out of your own world in order to recognize the value of your own history, your own culture. So it was only when I came to Britain that I actually started reading ancient Chinese philosophy. Of course, translations more than anything else. And I actually discovered that, So I'll come to that in a minute. I've just skipped the thing. So the question becomes, why is language, logic, and representation inadequate? Is it, as most people seem to imply, because reality is far too complex and multifaceted? We don't have the sufficient taxonomic categories, for example, to try and fully represent what we experience. So no singular perspective is adequate. So there's this kind of plurality of paradigms, if you might, you know. Or is the problem a little bit more fundamental? And this is what I believe, because reality is perpetually changing. The act of naming, of representing, fixes. It becomes static, you know. We use words like it is and it is not. You know, we don't have, there's no window here, and in Greece it doesn't seem to rain at all, but I was told it rained a few days ago. But we can look out of the window and we say, oh, it is raining, or it is not raining. But you know what happens if you have a few little drops coming down and it's not quite yet raining and not quite yet not raining? Where is it? If we don't have a ising or is noting, for example, you know, do you know how I would say it in my dialect? In Chinese, it would be lo yi. In Cantonese, or xia yi in Mandarin. In my dialect, I would say lo ho, which means simply falling rain. There is no is. So, you know, the language does actually influence how we actually track this reality. Anyway, so William James puts it very well. If you understand life by concepts, you're arresting its movement, cutting it up into bits as if with scissors, and then immobilizing these in our logical herbarium. And again, and so now, going back to the ancient Chinese text, the first line of the Tao Te Ching says, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. Why this paradox, or apparent paradox? Well, the problem is in the naming. The naming fixes. It fixes something that is not fixable, as it were. And of course, even when I say not fixable, I'm also using words. So I'm caught in this bind as well. Right? Can you see why? Further on in the Tao Te Ching, it says, he who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know. So we're trapped. A Japanese contemporary philosopher, Keiji Nishitani, writes, reflects this sentiment when he writes that there is a deep-seated suspicion of language, that we are aware in the Orient of the incompetence of utterance as the modes of man's being in regard to that which should remain unspoken. Okay, so this kind of paradoxical utterances, somehow, by chance, I discovered that was also in the writings of Heraclitus, in his many fragments. The most well-known one that most people would, that has been popularized is you never step into the same water twice. But apparently this is what he more accurately say, upon those who step into the same rivers flow other and yet other waters. Okay? And so Heraclitus seemed to subscribe to this processual worldview, that reality is in flux and ever-changing, that becoming takes precedence over being, process over outcome, activity over substance, change over persistence, novelty over continuity, and so on. In a word, as Harry reminded me a long time ago, pantare, which is a kind of Greek. I then realized that whilst in the West, Bergson, James, Whitehead, and even more recently, people like the physicists like David Bohm, Ilya Prigogine, and so forth, they have actually come up in support of this more processual view of the world, as it were. But in the Orient, this way of thinking has been with us for the best part of 3,000 years. It is a book of change, not a book of states. In the writings of Lao Tzu and Chuang Tzu and so forth. So, as Whitehead acknowledges, process philosophy seems to approximate more to some strains of Indian or Chinese thought than Western or Asiatic thought. The key principle, overriding principle, accompanying this process worldview is that of becoming. That how an actual entity becomes constitute what it is. Its being is constituted by its becoming. That what really exists are not things made, but things in the making. How do you use this way of thinking to apprehend and maybe interrogate our lived experiences? I find that the writings of Tim Ingold, the anthropologist Tim Ingold from Aberdeen University, I find his work incredibly rich in detail. You know, someone who can actually write a whole chapter on just sawing a piece of plank. Yeah, and with incredible richness in his descriptive, so you feel almost as if this is how skill is actually developed, as it were. So here is Ingold in a recent publication. In a world of becoming, even the ordinary, the mundane, the inconspicuous, the intuitive gives cause for astonishment. The kind of astonishment that comes from treasuring every moment as if in that moment we were encountering the world for the first time, sensing its pulse, marveling at its beauty, and wondering how such a world is possible. In other words, it's really about getting to the fine little nitty-gritty details of how things emerge. It's about attending, paying particular attention to the hidden, the invisible, and the inconspicuous. So what implications does this whole metaphysical predisposition, let us call it, have for the way we examine and theorize organization and organized lives? Well, I suppose pretentiously I will identify 7 methodological imperatives. I'll run them through. First thing is to acknowledge Wittgenstein's call to get back to that rough ground, that whole hurly-burly of human actions. Not what people say they do, but the observation of what they actually do. That blooming, buzzing confusion or aboriginal sensible muchness, unwarped by the sophistication of theory. Or what Bob Cooper calls that 0 degree of organization as a starting point of our inquiry. And then, striving for a kind of innocent, childlike, pristine seeing. What Anton Ahrensweig, an art theorist, apparently art students are taught this thing called artistic rigor, or to develop this thing called artistic rigor. He defines artistic rigor as an uncompromising democracy of vision. In other words, it is about not allowing categories to come and interrupt your viewing. An uncompromising democracy of vision. You know, I love that sort of expression. I guess in a way it is what William James was trying to get at when he talked about pure experiencing. And of course, this was taken up subsequently by the Japanese philosopher Nishida Kitaro in a book written in 1921 called An Inquiry into the Good, where he used this idea of pure experience to develop his own foundational notion of absolute nothingness. this point where everything merges, as it were. There is no differentiation as yet. John Ruskin also talks about the innocence of the I. I don't know, some people apparently say that Mahatma Gandhi was very influenced by Ruskin's Unto This Last. And in one of the paragraphs there, he talks about the importance of this ability to see clearly. And he writes, to see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. Interestingly, this striving for a pure, innocent, childlike seeing is also advocated by the Japanese industrialist Konosake Matsushita. He calls it Sunao mind. This ability to look at things as they are at that moment without bias or preconception. Sunao apparently in Japanese means meekness, tractability, and childlikeness, open-hearted childlikeness. And he insists that it is a policy that he cultivates in his conglomerate to help them ensure that they will see better and hence make more informed decisions. Well, you can see that my point about observing, there are different, shall I say, qualities. Not all observations are of equal quality, okay? And sometimes it is the ability to see things as they are that makes a real difference. Now, here's a comment that I picked up, which I thought at that time, this is February, I think it was this year, when he was asked, why are you so adamant about this anti-austerity stance, he says, well, I know this is the right thing because all you have to do is look into the eyes of the hungry of people in the streets. So it's not about reason, it's not about logic, it's about the reality that you confront, okay? So it's not about looking at the big things, the spectacular, it's not about the heroic, it's not about the dramatic, but it's all really about the mundane, the small, the seemingly insignificant. And this has always been understood in these ancient or truisms, both in the Western world and in the Chinese world. It's about prioritizing situated, embedded, and concrete knowing. Hubert Dreyfus, whose work I'm very enamored by, talks about the fact that our primary understanding of the world is pre-ontological. We dwell in our actions and practices without even noticing or trying them or trying to spell or are able to spell them out. Michel de Soto has a beautiful phrase, our knowledge is as blind as that of lovers in each other's arms. This sense of us being wrapped up in our knowing, as it were. And of course, Pierre Bourdieu has written substantially about the fact that there is a logic of practice which is not that of the logicians. Fifthly, the idea of skills. What is a skill? Well, most of us tend to think of skills as the acquisitions of mental representations and then applied. But for people like Dreyfus, skill is about the ability to discriminate finely between situations. It's just about knowing the differences that make a difference. Now, you can't, in a sense, represent the differences. that make a difference. So it's not amenable to mental representation, but you know. I'm a very avid sort of watcher of sports. And of course, I'm very interested in golf. Okay, at the recent U.S. Open, the chap who finally won the golf tournament was a guy called Jordan Spieth, and he displayed an incredible ability on very, very difficult greens to read the subtle borrows and nuances, and that's why he won. His putting was number one compared to the rest. That's the difference. Okay? So the ability to read these subtle things which other people can't seem to see. If you watch Wimbledon now, which is going on, you can see these kinds of little moments when things turn, momentum shifts and so forth. This is when a skilled player takes advantage of. Okay? If you ask him or her how this happens, it would be impossible to represent. It is just about knowing subtle differences between situations. So skill is really about the capacity for more and more finely discriminating between situations. It's about detecting differences that really make a difference. And it is something cultivated and nurtured so that when we talk about someone who is skillful, it is because he or she has responded appropriately, made the best of the affordances offered by a situation or an environment. Where action is purposive, but not purposeful. Dreyfus calls it absorbed practical coping. We can act without necessarily having long-term plans and clearly specified objectives or end goals. And this is, there's a young philosopher at Amsterdam University, his name is Eric Rietveld, who calls this skill intentionality. It is, in a sense, not deliberate intentionality. So we could act in every sense, and yet none of this would have to enter our consciousness. And if we see and observe consistency in people's responses, it is more due to habitus and dispositions, habituated responsiveness, rather than to the fact that there's an end goal that is aspiring to. So our explanatory scheme changes, as it were. And when we look at very impressive human accomplishments, civil society, language, money, medieval cities, and so forth, who designed this? Who planned this? Nobody, really. And this is what Adam Smith, a contemporary of Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, wrote about in his study on the evolution of civil society. Mankind, in striving to remove inconveniences, arrive at ends which even the imagination could not anticipate. Every step and every movement of the multitude are made with equal blindness to the future, and nations stumble upon establishments which are indeed the result of human action, but not the execution of any human design. In other words, we can become successful. We can achieve many things without actually intentionally striving to do so. And in fact, that is probably more sustainable. Here's the paradox, that the more deliberate you are, possibly the more you create the kind of unintended consequences that come back and haunt you. So, to summarize, life is basically perpetual becoming, an unfolding drama. It brings with it all kinds of surprises and affordances. And it's only whether or not we know how to make the best of it. Okay? I guess to my friends, my Greek friends, who are worried and concerned about this situation that they are confronted with, almost seemingly a no-win situation, I say to them, it is you that makes it happen. It is you that determines the future from what you are given. 50 years ago, next month, Singapore will celebrate 50 years of its ejection from Malaysia. When we were ejected from Malaysia, most of the experts and economists left us for dead. We had no natural resources, nothing. Today, it is a different, and you take the future into your own hands, basically. You make it happen. This is consistent with the notion of becoming. There are no predetermined, in a sense. Secondly, it requires a kind of radical empiricism. The being totally in touch with what is really going on in order to inform decision-making. And this requires a kind of rigor, not scientific rigor, but artistic rigor. The kind of rigor that allows the situation to reveal itself to us, rather than prejudging it with our categories. And finally, everyday skill. If we see an impressive organizational accomplishment, always think about the fact that this is probably an outcome of everyday practical coping, habituated actions. Nothing much more than that. The mundane, the serendipitous play an important role in eventual outcomes. Thank you for your time. I want to end by sharing with you a story which was told to me many years ago when I was still in this industry. And it is about how hard it is to revise our understanding of the world. And in a sense, it is about learning to let go. We have to somehow unlearn to learn again. I call it the Zen and the art of unlearning. This is Zen Master Tanaka. He lives in Kyoto, the ancient heart of Japan. And he's a master of the tea ceremony. I don't know if you know much about the tea ceremony, but it is a very revered process in Japan, and it can take several hours to prepare tea. So you think, why would anybody waste so much time? Well, a young anthropologist from California also thought so. So he decided, he studies Japanese culture, and he can't quite understand why the Japanese make such a big fuss of this tea ceremony. So he says, I'll get to the bottom of this. I'll fly to Japan, meet this Zen master, and I'll just show that there's all a lot of embellishment, basically. A bit of hocus pocus, if you mind. So he flies into Kansai Airport near Osaka, hops onto a bullet train, ends up at Kyoto, and ends up at the doorsteps of Zen Master Tanaka. All right? The Zen Master sees him at the door, welcomes him in, and he proceeds to serve tea. He takes 2 cups, one for himself and one for the visitor, and then he takes a pot of tea and he starts to pour. Now he's 90 years old, so his hands are pretty unsteady, okay? Eventually, however, his cup is full, and he goes to his visitor's cup, and he starts filling the visitor's cup. And eventually, the cup also fills. But he keeps pouring. So tea begins to overflow. And the young man is thinking to himself, poor old man, he can't seem to coordinate his movements. Never mind. I shall be polite and not pretend I didn't notice. More tea goes in. Now the tea is overflowing onto the mat and onto the floor. And this young fellow is thinking, what's wrong with this guy? Can't he see the cup is full? More tea goes in. Now it's all over. And it's almost dripping towards him, you know. Eventually, he can't contain himself. And he says, Zen Master, please stop. Can't you see? My cup is so full of tea. No more will go in. And the Zen Master looked at him and said, you are exactly like this cup of tea. You are so full of knowledge. How can I pour any more into you? Unless you empty your cup, no more knowledge will come into you. To learn, you have to unlearn. In order to grasp, it is necessary to first let go, release. Thank you very much.